Hello everybody, Sniping is Fun here, and I'm welcoming you all back to my next video and present to all of you here on YouTube. A couple of days ago, I basically presented my top 30 games that I wanted to put in the Super Nintendo Classic Edition. And I did mention online, after the NES Classic Edition was actually announced and mentioned, for a November release this year, a plug-and-play 30 classic NES, Nintendo, and third-party system, with a lot of great classic games in there from Nintendo and other companies as well, like Konami and Capcom. That a lot of people online were talking about basically the possibility of Nintendo doing this for their other systems, talking about doing it for like a Game Boy or Super Nintendo or 64 or GameCube or Game Boy Advance or Game Boy Color or something like that. People online were talking about them doing it on that, especially on the Super Nintendo. And I did do that video. If you guys want to see the 30 games I would include in the Super Nintendo Classic Edition, it's on my channel. It's only, if you look into my channel, my videos, it's only a couple of videos down compared to this one. Or I very well might just put it in the description, a link to the video if you really want to go see it and don't want to go searching through my channel. However, I also wanted to continue the train of me speculating on 30 games for these classic systems, and I also wanted to do a version of me doing 30 games for the Nintendo 64. Another system that's actually close to my heart and nostalgic. I basically talked about how the Super Nintendo was like my first ever video game system outside the original Game Boy, but the Nintendo 64 came very soon after as well, and is also not only one of the greatest Nintendo systems really ever made, in a technical sense. It does have a lot of great games on it. It is one of my favorites, and it is a very nostalgic system to me and to many other gamers around the world. So I wanted to throw my hat into the pot on trying to speculate and predict if Nintendo ever did do on N64, Nintendo 64 Classic Edition, what 30D games I would include in that. Now, when it came to the Super Nintendo, that was both easy and hard because you could really pick out a lot of games in there. But at the same time, you know for a fact, if you pick only 30 games, you're going to be missing out on a lot of games, Nintendo or third-party games. And I think I did a pretty darn good job trying to pick games out for that. When it came to this, it's kind of the same thing. It's easier and harder. It's a little bit easier because, unlike the Super Nintendo, I think the variation in terms of games on the N64 wasn't really as big, so you can pick all the biggest games out easily without leaving out too many games off your list. But it's also bad because there are a lot of more games than 30 for the Nintendo 64 to actually include in something like this, to the point where it's like, you're going to be missing out on some classics. Nintendo or third party. Especially on third party, when it comes to the Nintendo 64. Now, and I did the same thing with the Super Nintendo list. I stayed away from games that were licensed based. So I tried to stay away from like WF No Mercy and WrestleMania 2000, all the wrestling games, all the Aki wrestling games, GoldenEye 007, and a lot of like the very license-based games like the superheroes and stuff like that, the fighting games and whatever stuff like that they had at the time. So I tried to stay strictly to video game IPs, video game franchises. And while I'm not as 100% on liking the list that came up with the Nintendo 64 here that I did with the Super Nintendo list, I think I came up with a pretty good 30 games list to actually kind of make this system worth buying if they ever made it. Now, let's get this started so this video doesn't go on too long. Let's see where we can go from here. Now, obviously, like I mentioned with the Super Nintendo, Mario is the big main mascot of Nintendo, so you need to make sure the Mario games are well and plenty in this system. And just like the Super Nintendo one, a lot of Mario games I did put on the list, but surprisingly enough, there were more Mario games, obviously, on the Nintendo 64 than there were on the Super Nintendo. So it was easier for me to put in more, Mario games on this version. Now, when it came to the Super Nintendo one, I only had 4 games. I have 6 Mario games I'm putting on here, and I made sure to pick all the different variations, all the different genres and franchises that were out at the time. Now, the first easiest one to pick would be Super Mario 64, because it was a launch game for the system. Mario's Jump to 3D, very classic platforming game. We need Mario 64 in this because it's like the start of the N64 era. Then there's Paper Mario. Obviously, it's the continuation of like the Mario RPG game from the Super Nintendo, but now it's obviously in paper, a different, different coat of paint, but the same type of thing. Turn-based RPG with quirky Mario, elements to it that make it really fun. Cool characters, cool story, cool universe, and it's an RPG to include on this, which the N64 kind of, quite frankly, lacked. Then there is Mario Kart 64. It's the continuation of Mario Kart. It's a big multiplayer game, and I did focus on a lot of games that were multiplayer, whether it's 2-player or up to 4 players, because the N64 was the big multiplayer-based system for Nintendo. The first time they include 4 ports on the system, so obviously the NES Classic Edition, the N64 Classic Edition would have ports for 4 controllers. I tried to make sure there was big multiplayer focus like I did on the Super Nintendo one, and like they are doing with the NES one. So there's Mario Kart 64, like one of, if not the best Mario Kart game, good battle mode, good cups racing, fun action. Then we have, I wanted to include a Mario Party game, and what I consider to be, a lot of people consider to be the best Mario Party game of the N64 era would be Mario Party 2. Now it had like fun boards you can go on, mini games. It's a good multiplayer game to include. I just picked that one because it's considered the best out of the bunch. You could also pick 3 if you really want to, but I would say maybe not pick the first one. Then 2 Mario sports games, Mario Golf and Mario Tennis, which were both really fun Mario sports games. You need those in there too, and they're big multiplayer games. Now, on to Legend of Zelda. Obviously, you have to include both Legend of Zelda games. You have to include Ocarina of Time, which is a classic, and Majora's Mask, which is also pretty much a flipping classic as well, and they're both big, long, action RPG, adventure-type games. Some of the favorites in the series, some of the biggest games in the Legend of Zelda series. The jump to 3D really is very much needed there. Then F-Zero X, a good 4-player racing game just like Mario Kart, but now it's fast-paced action and, crashing yourself off the course and dying. It's pretty much a hard game, not as hard as GX, but it's a bit harder than the original one was. And also metal music, which is really freaking awesome. Need that F-Zero X in there. It's a continuation of F-Zero. Then you have the 1080 snowboarding game, which is the start of the 1080 series, and it's also a semi-sports-esque game that you can have it included in there. The start of the series, and it's 2-player snowboarding action. It's pretty much a fun game. Then Wave Race 64, which is the continuation of the Game Boy Wave Race game, 2-player action jet ski racing game. Really a classic on the Nintendo 64. Then the most obvious choice to include on this, the original Super Smash Bros. The start of the series, and it's obviously a classic in the series. It started the Super Smash Bros. Series, one of the most popular Nintendo franchises, throwing all their IPs, all their franchises, characters into a big hodgepodge fighting game, 4-player action, beat-em-up fighting game. You kind of need that to be in there. It's the start of a series, and you can get a lot of newer fans onto the original Smash Bros., which may not have experienced the original. Then Excitebike 64, which is a continuation of Excitebike franchise. It's kind of quite a bit of classic in the series, too. It's kind of the odd man out, the one that stands out, because unlike the original NES, which then they did World Rally on the Wii, which kind of went for a 3D variation on that, it was like the first full-blown 3D one. Now, what might kind of hold Excitebike 64 back a little bit is they did have a lot of motocross licensing in the game, for racers. If that doesn't impact, if that doesn't really hold the game back from being in this collection, it's okay. But if they can, maybe they can kind of go in there and remove the names of the characters and maybe just throw in fake ones and then take out the announcers for it too if they really want to. It's just might take a little extra work. And then this is also the generation where Pokemon became a big thing for Nintendo. So I wanted to make sure I represented that game franchise quite well here on the N64 collection. Now, it might have been bigger on the Game Boy Color, the handhelds, but the N64 had its own fair share of Pokemon games. Now I'm going to start with Pokemon Snap, which is a classic. A lot of people like it. You'd be able to take your pictures of your Pokemon, do all that fun stuff, and it is a franchise. It is basically a spin-off of Pokemon that people want a sequel to, and now if you bring it back and you get its fair share of love. Maybe on the NX we might see a Pokemon Snap 2 finally, which we should have saw on the Wii U, but Nintendo obviously didn't think so for some apparent freaking reason. Then I wanted to include Pokemon Stadium in the easiest choice because it has more content. It's Pokemon Stadium 2. You have all the quizzes, all the extra, the newer mini games. It has Generation 1 and 2 Pokemon, so you get the Kanto, Johto Pokemon. And it's also like up to 4 players, really fun. And then I include Pokemon Puzzle League, which might be a little bit harder because it's kind of based off the anime, but due to the fact that it's an anime that started out as a franchise from Nintendo, from a video game franchise, I included it anyways because I wanted to include a puzzle game, and I know they have other puzzle games on the N64, but I wanted to kind of stick with the Pokemon one just to kind of give Pokemon its extra little bit of love, and it also basically just Tetris Attack with Pokemon characters, so you pretty much get like Tetris Attack, and it just has the Pokemon stuff in it. Classic. Then Kirby 64 Crystal Shards, classic platforming 2D game. It shows more Kirby love. It's a really awesome game. You need Kirby 64 Crystal Shards in there. And then I have Yoshi's Story, which is another 2D platforming type game, and it shows an extra bit of love to Yoshi, just like I had Yoshi's Island, like Super Mario World 2 on the Super Nintendo one. This gives Yoshi his extra bit of love in there, besides obviously being in Smash Brothers and kind of showing up in like the Mario sports games and whatnot. Then we have Donkey Kong 64, and I know the whole Rare thing with there, but not Nintendo owns the Donkey Kong IP, the Donkey Kong franchise, the character. It is, while it is a collectathon, it is a classic in terms of N64, and you need it in there. And a lot of people love it, and it has the DK rap. And okay, you need Donkey Kong 64. He is a classic character. Then Diddy Kong Racing, which adds another racing game alongside F-Zero X and Mario Kart 64. It also is a multiplayer-based game. You can use all different vehicles, and it is pretty cool. I know it might be because maybe Rare, but they can kind of get it in there because they own the characters to an extent. And now, before we go any further, you can do it, but it would be hard to do a collection like this without the help of getting Rare games in there. So I wanted to mention it here before I get to the end. I do have Rare games at the end of this list. I didn't try to go overboard with them. I tried to pick only a select few, but I did pick Rare games at the end. Because I do think if Nintendo did an N64 Classic Edition, they would have to work with Microsoft to work with Rare in order to get the licensing for those games on the system, and they have to. They cannot leave out classics from Rare in this system. Just a forewarning for the end of the list. Then Star Fox 64, a continuation of the Super Nintendo one. It revamped what the FX chip was able to do for the original Star Fox on the Super Nintendo, and it just kind of revamped and made it a much better game. It included multiplayer. You could have 4-player dogfights. It was a blast, and it stood out as a continuation for Star Fox on the Nintendo 64, and then Pilot Wings 64, which was a continuation of Pilot Wings from the Super Nintendo. So it's like this system also that doesn't only debut like what was pretty much big at the time, new and big at the time, Pokemon, but it's a continuation of a lot of franchises that were on the Super Nintendo and the original Nintendo. Pilot Wings 64 being a big continuation of the original one. Maybe not as big as the original, but still a pretty big warranted classic game on the N64. Now this is when I start really kind of getting into third-party games on the system. Now, mostly every game I've so far picked so far have basically been Nintendo. Now, when I did the Super Nintendo one, it was pretty balanced, and there was a good amount of third-party games. But on the N64, they had a lot of good third-party games, but it was kind of hard to pick them once you got through all the really good Nintendo games, but there wasn't as many as the Super Nintendo. So the rest of this list is pretty much third-party games, or at least games that probably have more affiliation with third parties. Resident Evil 2. We need the Nintendo 64 version of Resident Evil 2. Now, it might not have all the cinematics and all the cutscenes and everything, but it is pretty much the same darn game. They were able to fit it on there. It was still a pretty good freaking version of the game. And it's Capcom's love to the N64 that we kind of need to show here. Which, on top of that, we also have Mega Man 64, or other known on the PlayStation 1, Mega Man Legends, which is it is a classic in the Mega Man franchise, the Mega Man Legends franchise, and it was on N64, and a lot of people loved it just as much as the PlayStation 1 version. It was still a really good game, and maybe if we put that in there, you get some more love for that part of the Mega Man franchise, and maybe Mega Man Legends 3 can be eventually brought back because of everyone wanting to play that, the original again, especially a lot of newer fans. Then we have Bomberman 64 Classic Bomberman game. You have the story mode, you have the multiplayer, 4-player action, blowing up all your friends with bombs, and you need to have it in there because it's a classic game on there. I picked Bomberman 64 specifically and not the other ones because it is the original and probably the biggest and most popular Bomberman game on the Nintendo 64. Then I picked Mischief Makers because it's like a classic kind of puzzle-ish platforming type game that has its cult status and defined itself on the N64. We need Mischief Makers in there as well. And then I picked Harvest Moon 64 because we kind of need like a sort of different genre game in there, and it was like a simulation type game. And I know I didn't include Harvest Moon on the Super Nintendo 1, and that could very well be a good game for the Super Nintendo Classic Edition. But I made sure to rectify that with this video, doing Harvest Moon 64, because building crops and doing all that stuff and getting married, having children, raising your family, and doing all your harvesting would be a fun thing for newer fans of the series to be able to experience an older classic Harvest Moon game. Now this leads us into the final 3 games on this list, and this is where I pick the rare games because they are needed. Now I didn't pick every single rare game. I did leave out Conquer, more so because of the M-rated status, even though I did put in Resident Evil, but Resident Evil is a classic franchise that you need. I did leave out Conquer, though. I wanted to include Conquer, but I left that out, and I did leave out Killer Instinct Gold because I thought I wanted to include in our fighting game, but I started running out of space, and I'm like, okay, I need this stuff first, and then I didn't have space for that. The 3 games I included, the 2 obvious ones are Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie. Those games define the N64. Nintendo needs to work with Microsoft and Rare to get those on there. And then, because I couldn't get the licensing, because I didn't want to do the whole licensing thing for GoldenEye, I include Perfect Dark. So we can get a good 4-player first-person shooter game, and it is pretty much better than GoldenEye anyway, so there you go. And those are my 30 games for the Nintendo 64 Classic Edition. 30 games I will include now. I might personally, unlike the Super Nintendo version, which I might not change too much, this one I might look into it again, maybe rectify a few of my decisions and change a few more. But overall, I do think I'm decently happy with this list, and I think it would be a good 30 games to include on something like this. Now, put in the comment section what you guys think. Do you guys like the 30 games I picked? What games would you pick for the Nintendo 64 Classic Edition? Would you just keep my list, or would you switch some out? Or am I missing something? Or, so on and so forth. Put in the comment section there. We can discuss it there, have fun. And that's it. My name is Stephanie Swan. Peace, please subscribe if you want to. Have a nice day. See you all later in my next video. Bye.